Good morning. Happy Friday. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get this party started so that we don't slight anyone on their time. We have three amazing, awesome panelists that I know that you are going to be really fascinated with and enjoy. I also invite you all to have your notebooks and pens at the ready so you don't forget the awesome things the first person said by the time we get to the Q&A at the end. We'll be moving through three 20-minute presentations. I'm going to read their bios up front. The other thing that you should know, and I can remind you at the end, is that the Q&A session will also be recorded for posterity, so there will be mics going around. So wait for the mic to get to you, and when we do the Q&As, make sure the questions are questions. All right, let's launch into the bios. So first, we will be hearing from Christina Lambert of Hillsdale College. She will be speaking on Poems as Small Virgils, Tradition and Free Verse in the Organic Form of Denise Levertov. Christina Lambert is an associate professor of English at Hillsdale College, where she teaches American literature. Her work has been published by Christianity and Literature, Tulsa Studies and Women's Studies, Modern Fiction Studies, and the T.S. Eliot Studies Annual. She has a forthcoming chapter in a new collection on T.S. Eliot's drama through Edinburgh University Press, and her current book project explores the intersection of food studies and Eucharistic theology in the poetry and drama of T.S. Eliot and Denise Levertov. Secondly, we will be hearing from Joshua Wren of Wise Blood Books and also University of St. Thomas MFA program. He'll be talking on a classical descent into contemporary hell, tradition, and the individual talent in Dana Joy's underworld. So by way of a bio, Joshua Wren is founder and editor of Wise Blood Books, co-founder of Great Books Honors College at Belmont Abbey, and co-founder of the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the University of St. Thomas, Houston. Joshua regularly publishes essays and poems in such journals as the Los Angeles Review of Books and First Things, America, and Public Discourse. Joshua is the author of 10 books, including How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, the novels Infinite Regress and Blue Walls Falling Down, and the theological aesthetic manifesto Contemplative Realism. Joshua's Faith in the Furnace of Doubt, Dana Joy's Visionary Poetics, CUEA Press 2025, and More Than a Matter of Taste, The Moral Imagination and Spirit of Literature, Word on Fire 2026 are forthcoming. And finally, last but definitely not least, we have Ryan Wilson of the University of St. Thomas, Houston, who will give us a portrait of the contemporary poet as Aeneas. Ryan Wilson's books include, most recently, In Ghostlight, Poems from LSU in 24, and Contemporary Catholic Poetry, an anthology from Paraclete Press, also in 2024. His work appears widely in periodicals such as 32 Poems, First Things, Hopkins Review, Image, The New Criterion, the Sewanee Review, and the Yale Review, and has been anthologized in Best American Poetry, Christian Poetry in America since 1940, and elsewhere. The longtime editor-in-chief of Literary Matters, he is currently editing editions of John Dryden's Traditions from Virgil, due out from Wise Blood Books next year. He is Associate Professor of Poetry in the MFA program at the University of St. Thomas, Houston, and he lives in a lovely small town in Houston, outside of Houston. So, we will invite up to Whoop, there we go. Christina.
Is there a way to make this full screen? Let's see. Yeah, there
The presenter. Oh, I'm sorry. I know what I didn't do.
Our hero, thank you.
Yeah, I practiced, but I didn't get it again. You do the presenter thing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Tamara. In a 1965 essay, Some Notes on Organic Form, the American poet Denise Levertov describes her own poetic form as organic. By this she means that the poet's work is primarily responsive to take in the reality of the things described, be it an object, experience, or emotion, and write in such a way that not only the content, but also the form, sound, and rhythm reflects its reality. Her essay begins, "For me, back of the idea of organic form is the concept that there is a form in all things and in our experience, which the poet can discover and reveal." St. Augustine's essay on order begins, "There is an order to be found within things and between them, which binds and directs this world." Augustine proceeds to describe that to retain that order, to, quote, "open one's eyes and others toward it," is difficult and very uncommon. Without even acknowledging the use of Augustine's framework, mature poets steal, after all, Levertov agrees and assigns this work of seeing and attending to the poet. But whereas Augustine says that the one who sees order must retreat into the interior and avoid the crowding of things, Levertov sends the poet into the world and charges them with apperceiving, as Hopkins coined, quote, "the inscape of all things." Levertov's own description of her form explicitly draws from Hopkins and implicitly from Augustine, illustrating that hers is not simply an understanding of poetic form, but of the nature of reality. Born from this view of reality, she says that the goal of poetry is, quote, "faithful attention to experience." Contrary to iconoclastic depictions of free verse, she situates this formal understanding as, quote, "a religious devotion to the truth." Her theory for organic form provides a structure for this poetic mode, much like Eliot's own discussion of vers libre. But structure is perhaps the wrong word, for the word organic doesn't imply a house, but a plot of soil, an ecosystem, rather than a building. While Levertov later bemoans that shampoo companies have co-opted the word organic for her, she rejects the title of free verse as inadequate. This word, organic, understood ecologically rather than commercially, captures something about the paradox of Levertov's deeply rooted, yet innovative poetry. The ecological language here is significant because all of us enjoy the gifts of creation, whether we live up to our role in stewarding them or not. Just so, poetry is always shaped by a tradition, whether or not a poet recognizes it and stewards this relationship to tradition or not. But Levertov is not accidentally shaped by tradition. I would argue that her organic form and poetic vocation is precisely what allows her to gratefully receive and be transformed by the many voices from the tradition in her life and her work. It's easy to miss the traditional side of Levertov because of her contemporary mode of poetry and paradoxical biography. Born in East London in 1923, Levertov was raised by a Hasidic Jew turned Anglican priest. She was steeped in Judeo-Christian religious traditions and the romantic poetry and literary tradition of her country of origin. She married an American and moved to the US in 1948. He was a famous Vietnam War draft dodger alongside of Norman Mailer. In the company of the Black Mountain Poets and William Carlos Williams, her poetry found its distinctly American lyric voice. In the late 60s and 70s, working at Stanford and Berkeley, her poetry began giving attention to political topics. She began writing engaged verse protesting the Vietnam War, and for this decision, she lost audiences and friendships. In the 80s and 90s, she made another costly turn, this time into the Christian faith of her youth. She was baptized into the Roman Catholic Church in 1990, won the Christianity and Literature Lifetime Achievement Award in 94, and died in 1997. How does Levertov, as Whitman would say, contain such multitudes? What moves a poet to draw upon Dante for her protest poetry and join the Roman Catholic Church while writing about St. Thomas and Oscar Romero? The answer, I believe, is in her organic form, which brings her both to protest poetry and to the faith. So scholars usually conceive of three distinctive phases in Levertov's life and career, but I think that it's her organic form that unifies her paradoxical poetic work and life. In her poem, A Common Ground, I think we find the best ars poetica for Levertov's organic form, where she imagines the words of the tradition as the soil of poetics. The poem begins, "To stand on common ground, here and there gritty with pebbles, yet elsewhere fine and mellow, uncommon fine for plowing." As the poem begins, the ground underfoot is common, meaning that it's both ordinary and, more importantly, shared. With the incorporation of an unattributed quotation at the end of the stanza, the speaker gives over her voice to another, and by doing so, displays what makes this soil quite so fine, the labor of another. Referencing two kinds of soil reflects what we know of soil science, the reality that the dirt we pass in fields, perhaps on our way to South Bend, is an organic material highly dependent upon geography, climate, and crops. A large part of the organic quality of farmable land depends entirely upon whom exactly farmed the land the year before and how. The second stanza combines what is received with the labor of those who work on the land in the present. They are to labor, planting the vegetable words diversely in their order that they come to virtue. This common ground is not simply for standing, but for laboring and planting. The triumph of the work is marked by the concluding exclamation mark, a triumph experienced by anyone who has ever seen a plant transform from seed to food. Quite an accomplishment. What has been inherited must be combined with labor for the seeds to be transformed from potential to reality. Of course, the entrance of words denotes our place within an extended metaphor. Under the good management of the farmer-poet, these words might take root and propagate. Describing the words here as vegetable implies their nascent, growing form, but also that words are organic, and that they are responsive and dependent upon environment in the way that seeds are to light, water, and soil health. The words are not simply in her pockets, another metaphor that she uses, but they're truly in the soil of her language. And this soil is transformative for the food that is grown there. In the closing stanzas of section 1 of the poem, the image goes that final step, from the material conditions of the soil to the labor of the farmer to the food on the table, to crunch on words grown in grit or fine crumbling earth, sweet to eat and sweet to be given, to be eaten in common by laborer and hungry wanderer. To consume words on a page or enjoy language has the same satisfying crisp crunch as biting into a ripe vegetable. The word sweet is repeated twice and left enjammed and unencumbered by punctuation at the end of the fourth stanza, emphasizing the two actions, eating this food, but also giving it away. The farmer-poet eats the meal she has grown by the help of another, and the goal of this slow agrarian metaphor for writing is that others will be nourished by it, extending the heritage of words to another generation, and inviting a community of readers to the table for this feast of language. So not only is the planting work done in common, but so is the eating. There is a moral valence to this image. Food sustains the self, the laborer, but is also meant to be given to the hungry wanderer, invoking the ancient rite of hospitality. The farmer-poet was working with a given reality of rich, inherited soil, so the fruit of the land never solely belonged to her anyways. Levertoff's metaphor is deeply ecological in that it reveals those interconnections that always exist but are rarely visible. Interconnections that dictate certain moral responses in terms of labor, preservation, and generosity. For Levertoff, the work of the poet depends upon the given and demands a response in labor to the fullness of this reality. So, where does this responsive, grateful mode of poetics take her? Everywhere. To Vietnam, protest poetry, and then to the church. Albert Gelpi describes the severe criticism Levertoff received as she began to write poetry protesting the violence in Vietnam. While Robert Duncan and others saw Levertoff's political poetry as undermining her imaginative vision and, quote, corrupting her sense of language, Levertoff saw it simply as a necessary result of her poetic attention. She writes in the early 80s, a favorite quotation of mine, "Crass, complacent obliviousness to suffering obviously does not coexist with imagination. The insensitively cheerful are uncreative." Writing during the 1970s, Levertoff and the world watched for the first time live footage of a war on TV. I think our parallel today is seeing videos of violence on our phones. Never have we had access to so much information, so many statistics, and with so few resources to process or understand what we see. Levertov describes the problem of her own time as raising a generation with, quote, criminally neglected imaginations. Like Eliot in The Wasteland, Levertov claims that in a world where we are inundated with violence, the real tragedy is that we have lost the ability to lament. Levertov's visceral political poetry is simply responsive to what she sees, echoing that organic mode, but her responsiveness draws upon the past to meet the present circumstances. Aligning herself with a very long literary tradition, Levertov posits that this is the role of what she calls the artist guide. Levertov describes the act of giving people harsh facts and images of violence without the companion of art as the equivalent of sending Dante the Pilgrim into the Inferno without a Virgil. And if you imagine that, you think the Pilgrim would still be there. For Levertov, no one models engaged poetry, the work of grasping the paradoxical intensity of the harsh and beautiful reality of the world, like Dante, whose work quite literally touches heaven and hell. In Goodbye to Tolerance, Levertov calls poets unwilling to give witness to the violence around them neutral fellows, invoking Dante's anti-inferno, where denizens must chase a flag forever, for they followed nothing in life. The greatest condemnation she can cast is irresponsiveness. In the stanza following, she expands on this image of neutrality. She writes, "And you, good women, bakers of nicest bread, blood donors, your crumbs choke me. I would not want a drop of your blood in me. It is pumped by weak hearts, perfect pulses that never falter, irresponsive to nightmare reality." The speaker here rejects the baked bread and a blood donation, surely a failed Eucharist, of well-intentioned women because of its rejection of the paradox that Dante comprehends but modern poetry fails to see. Only poems that respond to the fullness of the reality of the world, that guide hearts and minds and emotions into clear sight of fellow human beings, become, quote, stepping stones in one slow pilgrimage, or small Virgils, leading the soul's Dante around the spiral of hell and paradise. It is in Dante that Levertov finds a way to respond, to guide, to educate imaginations in her engaged poetry. But the proof of Levertov's fundamentally responsive posture is perhaps best found in her religious turn. There are two significant moments in Levertov's conversion, and they both begin with poetic form. To tackle the story of doubting Thomas, Levertov borrows from the Roman Catholic liturgy, writing what she calls an agnostic mass. To see Thomas rightly, she must use the form of his tradition, quite literally taking his and her own questions to church, in a 6-part poem that begins with the Kyrie and ends with the Agnus Dei. Following Thomas through his doubts and the Mass through its liturgy, she meets in the lines the person you're supposed to meet at Mass, God. She recalls, "When I had arrived at the Agnus Dei, I discovered myself to be in a different relationship to the material and the liturgical form from that which I had begun." She takes up the form to give witness to Thomas's journey of doubts moving to faith, and the form, in turn, becomes a space for her to inhabit, and inhabiting it, to find a home. Something similar occurs when composer Newell Hendricks asked Levertov to write a libretto on a topic of her choosing. Oscar Romero had just been killed in El Salvador, and Levertov takes up the mantle of T.S. Eliot, saying, "The murder of an archbishop never loses its significance. Think of Murder in the Cathedral." Levertov does not simply borrow the topic from Eliot, but inhabits the central framework of his drama, intertwining politics, soil, and martyrdom to show how injustice touches all of creation, and transformation, both spiritual and material, comes from God. Eliot's dramatic form highlights the symbiotic relationship of the saints and the soil. And using this form, reading about Romero's life, Levertov is convicted to incarnate her ideas into action, and most importantly, belief. Here's an excerpt in the Dana Green biography, and this is from Levertov's journal after she's written on the life of Romero. "And at the same time that I experience this, I am aware of how untransformed I am. not in the least more willing to do good things politically, but rather feeling the impulse to live in and for art, nature, and not think about all the horrors. And also, as I read, and have quoted in the oratorio, about the love of the poor, I become very much aware that I don't love the poor. I really am an intellectual snob, I guess. And I like to be with people of refined manners and developed minds. Yet at the same time, I have a degree of faith I never had before, and a wish to try to earn some of the goodness I receive. And at the same time, the recognition that grace is by definition unearnable. She gives witness to Romero, and in return, he gives witness to her. But again, what kind of person is moved by the subject they are writing on? I keep thinking of our debates right now. It feels like there's a lack of movement in so many hearts. Someone whose form and life fundamentally depends upon movement, responsiveness, upon the belief that there is something in the world that demands our response. It is Levertov's well-worn muscle of attention that gives her religious roots. She is planted, in this instance, in a faith tradition by a new kind of artist guide who she renames in a later poet, quote, Christ the poet, who speaks in images. So to conclude, while still an agnostic, Levertov wrote a poem about her mentor, Muriel Rukeyser, while grieving the apathy of those around her and missing her friend's fierce witness. In her breathtaking poem, In Memory of Muriel Rukeyser, she simply states, she was a cathedral. Levertov uses the language of a religious tradition of which she is not yet a part to symbolize what the work of the church ought to be doing, acting as a landmark, pointing out the way, guiding belief and action. Later, she'll use this same language for Julian of Norwich. I like to think of the influences of Levertov as her great cloud of witnesses. Levertov's whole poetic mode, her organic form, allows her to be vulnerable to the artist guides, the cathedrals within the tradition, so that her poems might become small Virgils of their own. Her form allows herself and her work to be witnessed to and to be transformed, because her poetic mode is alive and malleable and necessarily dependent. Levertov's friendship with another artist guide of our time, Wendell Berry, makes a lot of sense to my mind. Their hope in a dark world is founded upon gratitude for those who have worked the soil before you and alongside of you. Even if what you harvest is plentiful, that abundance is only possible because the soil is necessarily common ground, richer for having been shared. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And it seems like Aeneas is maybe the strongest through line, and maybe more directly Virgil. And I know that in the MFA program at the University of St. Thomas, Ryan Wilson's remarks and teaching on even just the very first line of the Aeneid is legendary. So we're in for a treat. But meanwhile, I'm going to speak with you about the classical descent into a contemporary hell, tradition and talent in Dana Gioia's underworld. When we praise a poet, says T.S. Eliot, too often we isolate these aspects of his verse which least resemble anyone else's, which depart most from the work of his predecessors. In tradition and the individual talent, Eliot challenges the critic's inclination to pretend to find what is individual, what is peculiar in the essence of man, and fixate upon this quality with narrow-minded satisfaction. Truth be told, no artist has his complete meaning alone, for his significance is indissolubly tied to his relation to the dead poets and artists. For a full appreciation of his achievement, you must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. When we rid ourselves of the penchant for originality and invention in favor of situating the new in the stream of tradition, we may just find that not only the best and most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. Dana Gioia's long poem in progress, The Underworld, a portion of which I'll be speaking on today, but a poem that is literally being written as we speak and will eventually be a book-length poem, God willing, is his magnum opus, which has appeared just in pieces and piecemeal over a long period of time. It's clearly imagined under the influence of other poems that conceive of the katabasis of winds blowing down a slope, from the Greek descending, which itself is from katabanein, to go down, a compound of kata, down, and hanein, to go, walk, step. This word denotes trips to the underworld that have their archetype in Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus consults the prophet Tiresias. Such trips appear again in Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid, Seneca's Madness of Hercules, Ovid's myth of Orpheus, and Dante's Inferno. Aeneas' ancient descent has been with Gioia ever since he was a little boy. In the Los Angeles classroom of his childhood, he said, parsing my own 40 lines of classics homework from Virgil, for Latin was still just barely a living language, and wherever Latin went, Virgil presided. And if Virgil does not precisely preside over Gioia's incomplete epic, any parsing of the poem will find him overseeing the undertaking. Indebted to the dead, the underworld assumes an utterly contemporary idiom. Gioia's modernized underworld is defined by a peculiar blend of bureaucracy and mystery, a combination reminiscent of Kafka, a calm and collected rational irrationality that may be more hellish than any of the monsters imagined by his predecessors. In one published sequence entitled Satan's Management Style, the quarrel between ancient and new manifestations of evil is on full display, with section titles such as Punishment in the New Regime juxtaposed with L'Ancient Regime. And when Satan undergoes a management crisis, he applies a solution he might have picked up in a self-help business book: delegate, delegate. But surely he needed no professional consultations, for our guide assures us the Prince of Darkness is a visionary. While others, like God, threw in the towel watching the place unravel, Satan saw an opportunity beyond the chaos. The worst of human resources speak leaks through this pandering praise. Just look at hell. He took complete defeat and peddled cosmic liberation. The underworld tracks the travels of a person addressed only as you, who is guided by no Virgil or Sibyl, but rather by a nameless instructor who tries to properly prepare you for a harrowing visit to hell. Those who have previously passed through this caravan of horrors haunt your memory as you undertake a mysterious errand in honor of your uneasy dead. Steeped in grotesque mythological visions of what this place of punishment will be like, you are met by a litany of nothingness that reconfigures your understanding. The underworld's epigraph, posted like a sign alerting travelers to rough terrain, is taken from the Aeneid. Facilis descensus averno. Descending into the inferno is easy. In the first line, Gioia transposes the classical Latin into a contemporary colloquial key, as if readers were following a do-it-yourself tourist brochure that caters to the tediously straightforward, the streamlined step-by-step. It isn't difficult to visit hell, as long as you can follow the instructions. Get on the underground, the Western line, go to the final car, sit by yourself, in the last row. Don't talk to anyone. Don't exit when you reach the outmost station. Don't move, not even when the lights go off. Note the first negative rendering of Virgil's original. Here we have not the positive assertion of facilis descensus, but it isn't difficult. Joya's switch seems to sap some of the shock that comes with easy access underworld, a mythical place of eerie otherness, which is, in this poem, reached by the subway, a familiar, even pedestrian means of travel. In the Madness of Hercules, the underworld is also accessible, in Seneca's poem, via a famous cliff off Sparta's coast, and Joya preserves the sense that the underworld and ours are linked by a portal, but it is in the tunnels and subway platforms and dim and dirty stations which take you there that were once part of a flourishing civilization. Even now, they are unused by anyone except the dead. When the conductor comes to dispense tickets and retrieve the fare, we find only after the trade is made that each trade is final. You can see the poem up there. There are no returns. The pun on no return is, needless to say, not amusing, given the destination. Defeated expectations and reversals pervade the poem's second stanza. At first, you might be reassured because no money changes hands in fulfillment of this small change that the nameless train conductor levies. On the other hand, the very smallness of the fee suggests that the amount is maybe less important than the fact that you must pay. But then, just look at what you have to give away. At first, you might find mild assurance, for you can offer something of your own to appease the mindless lackey of Minos, dictator and judge of sins. But the stakes rise dramatically as the fee escalates from easily dispensable items to your smile, perhaps the memory of your mother. In Joya's underworld, inhabitants repeatedly appear indifferent to their fellow sufferers. And so, when his guide says, frankly, they aren't interested in you, it rings true. The damned, however, likely disagree. Perdition is a matter of perspective, the poem continues. What makes them notable may not be visible. Damnation is an essence, not an outfit. Why this is hell, or nor am I out of it, the instruments of pain become internal, barbed memory, the lash of consciousness. The damned, however, likely disagree. They are bent on advancing a subjective interpretation of their own situations. For them, perdition is a matter of perspective. Hell, in other words, is a hotbed for what Nietzsche called perspectivism. In The Will to Power, he insists that it is our needs that interpret the world, our drives, and their for and against. Out of each individual's lust to rule, he wishes to compel all the others to accept not his truth, but his perspective as a norm. There exists no shared reality, metaphysical or more modest. In spite of this subjectivist assertion, however, the poem continues, damnation is an essence and not an outfit. And here, hell is essentially a state wherein our instruments of pain become internal. Although, as Eric Auerbach notes in his book on Dante, some critics of the Italian see him as guilty of assembling haphazard products of an irresponsible fantasy, seeking to pile up horror after horror. In the Inferno, the worst aspect of damnation is internal. This in spite of some formidable monsters. Pope Nicholas is already writhing when Dante finds him upside down in a pseudo-baptismal font, as if that wasn't bad enough. But then Dante continues with a piercing invective that pains the former pontiff even further. You dared to use guile to win the lovely lady that you lacerated, says the pilgrim poet, furious over the highest cleric's abuse of the church. Pope Nicholas's 2 feet kicked like mad. The poem continues. Perhaps it was his rage that made him twitch, but Dante doesn't rule out conscience as the primary cause. The pain here is worse than any torments the whip-bearing demons could devise. And in City of God, one of Dana Joy's favorite books, St. Augustine approaches the same problem of punishment in hell through Mark chapter 9, verses 42 through 47, where Jesus warns of souls being cast into hellfire, where their worm dies not and the fire is not quenched. Some, he says, think that both the fire and the worm here mentioned are meant as pains of the soul rather than of the body. For the damned burn with anguish of the soul, Although Augustine, on the contrary, holds that there will be material worms and bodies, he acknowledges that both interpretations are possible. In Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky is another influence on Gioia. Father Zosima also takes up this question, but I think that if there were fire in a material sense, he says, they would be glad of it, the damned souls, taking an unexpected view. For I imagine that in material agony, their still greater spiritual agony would be forgotten for a moment. Moreover, that spiritual agony cannot be taken from them, Zosima continues, for that suffering is not external but within them. And actually, just last night I was reading in St. Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle, where she says the exact same thing, that she is not afraid of the terrors of hell, but rather of the gaze of Christ as he looks tenderly on the damned. This truth sends tremors through Gioia's underworld. The travelers who ventured here before, the living ones, he writes, who crossed into the shadows to violate this place, could not resist from questioning the dead. They hoped to learn forbidden things and yet remain untouched. There are some truths that only darkness knows. Such knowledge never comes without a price. What would the underworld be to us without these legendary heroes that the poem speaks of, who risked the descent? Consider Ovid's Orpheus, whose new wed bride dies young from a serpent's poison venom. He dared descend through Taenarus' dark gate to Hades to make trial of the shades, writes Ovid. Striking sublimely sad chords from his lyre, he pleads with Persephone and company, asking the fates to reweave his wife, else my resolve is clear, not to return, may two deaths give you cheer. I have come down, not with intent to see the glooms of hell, nor to enchain the triple snake-haired necks of Cerberus, but for my dear wife's sake. Although the underworld could not deny the prayers of Orpheus, and he meets Eurydice again as they depart from this murky gloom, just at the edge of the bright world, he looks back in fear, violating the compact, and she slips from his fingers with a faint farewell, turning back to the place from which she was just resurrected, leaving Orpheus bereft of his wits. The darkness drives Orpheus to madness. Such is to be expected, says Gioia's instructor, for others who ventured, those who crossed into the shadows to violate this place, could not resist from questioning the dead. Others besides Orpheus are more blameworthy, for they hoped to learn forbidden things and yet remain untouched. In Gioia's rendering, the deeper they explored, the more entangled, because the truths that darkness taught infected them, goading their descent. His verse resounds with Seneca's characterization of the path that begins to draw you down and the dark that turns ravenous, letting no one return. In the underworld, most of the legendary heroes are not searching now, but lost, indistinguishable from the shadows that they had questioned. Gioia's catabasis is stripped of the kind of horror tactics that we find in Dante's Inferno, where when they're waiting at the gates of the city of Dis, creatures whose hair is made out of vipers, handmaids of the Queen of Eternal Lamentation, were clawing at their breast with all their might, beating themselves and shrieking. No demons compete to falsely persuade the visitors that their powers surpass God's. No horned devils knock on the walls or shock with their visceral, puffed-up presence. Even though later, when you arrive in Dis, a cast of demons will meet you and entertain your curiosity, you'll find that they fall far short of the fear-inducing mythological furies of your forebears' centuries. Yes, there we go. Add to the catalog of disappointments the demons waiting on the station platform, pot-bellied, slovenly, none of them scary. It's sad to say, but you look forward to them. treacherous angels laughing operatically, but not these dime-eyed slackers. Shouldn't there be someone to rejoice in your damnation? Like a master advertiser, the evil one adapts his tactics to the age, appealing to the target demographic appetites of each era's inhabitants. This calmness seems a veneer of respectability, anxiety over making a scene in public at the moment when wailing and gnashing of teeth, my dear friends, would be in order. Just in the time that remains, I'm just going to focus on one other little image from the underworld and then conclude. In Joya's poem, the inversion of the cone in hell is no less gross than Lucifer's 3 mouths containing each a traitor as he chews eternally upon their duplicitous bodies in a conscious, rebellious, cannibalistic inversion of the unbloody Eucharistic feast. In Joya's poem, the fact that hell's unnatural rules strive to counter not only nature, but Christ's body and blood, threatening to send the darkness into you in place of the unleavened light, may be the poem's unexpected and most twisted witness amidst the nothingness to the holy sacrifice of the Mass in these lines. Taste anything in hell, a piece of bread, a sip of wine, and you invite the darkness into you. Virgil, writes T.S. Eliot, is peculiarly sympathetic to the Christian mind. The author of the Aeneid looks both ways. He makes a liaison between the old world and the new, the classical and the Christian. Gioia also stands at such an intersection, pondering the literary underworld since he studied Virgil in the classrooms of his childhood and later in adult life, as he studied at Harvard in the classroom of the classicist and Virgil translator Robert Fitzgerald. Like Virgil, Gioia looks both ways. He reads Virgil as a pagan Roman with messianic yearning, for to cite the 4th eclogue, heroes mingled with gods, in other words, the incarnation, a being who might simultaneously be fully man and fully God. Steeped in a range of revelatory pagan myths and philosophies, he finds them fulfilled and corrected by the full revelation of Christ, whom even Hellions can descry, however faintly, as the center of the cosmos. Thank you.
And then we don't need the other one up yet, so just escape thumbs the part.
Good morning. Can you all hear me? Great. Thank you, Joshua. As Joshua mentioned, I want to expatiate at great length on Virgil, but I did not, in the polite company gathered here together this morning, want to perpetrate such a close reading. So instead, I will present a parable with the hopes that maybe someday you will be glad to recall even this. My title is A Portrait of the Contemporary Artist as Aeneas, or What Advice Do You Have for Aspiring Writers? You, aspiring writers, are Aeneas. Congratulations. And I'm sorry. It doesn't matter where you're from, or what you look like, or how old you are. You are a child of love, and you have been called by the divine to bring love into the world. But you are beset by obstacles, trials, and tribulations. Whether or not you fulfill what you have been called to do remains uncertain. The difficulties you face are not only exterior to yourself. The most nettlesome difficulties are those which are interior, the ones no one can face for you, except you. There are temptations, heart-wrenching temptations, that will entice you to forego your calling. There are all too many reasons why you might be tempted to give up. The journey ahead of you is not brief, it is not easy. The spiritual odyssey you face may present you with an existential crisis more harrowing, dare I say, than contemporary airline travel is, if such a thing is possible. You begin in a civilization on fire. For the serious poet, a poet like Dante Alighieri, the starting point is positively hellish. All around you, you see mindlessness and selfishness and unbelief, and these are hard. But worse still, you see all around you lust and gluttony and greed, scourging unhappy people into acts that make them unhappier, and it is heartbreaking to behold. You see wonderful people resigned to sloth, having given up. And you see people with good hearts lost in wrath and hatred. Violence and fraud abound. On the one hand, you are tempted to fight fire with fire. On the other hand, you are tempted to pretend that nothing is happening, tempted to wish it all away, and simply seek escape however you can. But if you are a writer, you are also pius Aeneas, and you must not destroy yourself in a losing battle, nor simply run away in cowardice. You must fight through the flames to reach those you love, those who await you. You must seek out your child, who is a symbol of the future. And with your child, you must also seek out your father, Anchises. Let me adapt my parable by saying that you must seek out your own mothers and fathers, and they may be many. It is easier in the short run to leave your mothers and fathers to perish, to be consumed in the flames and forgotten. But in the long run, you cannot fulfill your divinely appointed destiny without Anchises. You cannot know where you are destined to go unless you know the place from which you've come. Now, here I will digress and note that for a very long time, American culture has neglected Anchises. Henry Ford, who invented the assembly line on which almost everything now is produced, famously said, "The past is bunk." Mr. Ford left Anchises to die, and he did so with a sneer. Untold millions have followed his example, as he himself was following the example of untold millions. The point is not to scapegoat anyone, but to recognize that for you, the fight even to reach Anchises is enormously difficult. Grammar schools no longer teach grammar. But without grammar, every language and literature that's ever existed becomes all but incomprehensible. Rhetoric, another stalwart member of the classical trivium taught for millennia, now is not only left untaught in most classrooms, but is also misunderstood as either empty bombast or emotional manipulation, cutting off contemporaries from almost all literature antedating the middle of the 20th century. Logic, that refinement of the rational thought that separates the human person from the animal and the third musketeer among the classical trivium, has been disparaged for almost 300 years and has been all but banished from the fine arts for over a century, meaning that philosophy and theology are become increasingly alien. In our time, many dismiss figures like Homer and Virgil, especially those who have never read them. Many more dismiss figures like Shakespeare with a shrug, because they lack the tools necessary to appreciate the staggering cathedral of beauty which Shakespeare built. The contemporary artist is almost invariably put in the position of necessarily becoming an autodidact. The young painter who seeks an MFA almost invariably finds that the MFA doesn't really teach painting or even drawing, but teaches digital installations designed to mock the love of beauty that made the painter want to paint in the first place. The young poet who seeks an MFA almost invariably finds that the MFA reduces poetry to the venting of grievances with line breaks. The techniques developed over 3,000 odd years have been left behind, dismissed as obsolete or reviled by those who never bothered to learn them. And so, as Aeneas had to fight through flames and through an army intent on destroying him, you must fight to reach Anchises. He is not the same for everyone. For some, he looks like Willa Cather or Flannery O'Connor. For others, he looks like Po Chu-yi or Wang Wei. For others, he looks like Jorge Luis Borges and Franz Kafka. For others, he looks like Derek Walcott and Dante Alighieri. All the same, you must fight for your Anchises. When you have reached Anchises, you will be tempted to remain with him, to remain in Troy among the flames. But you cannot. You must carry your father on your back, along with the lares and penates of your household and your culture. You must take up your personal past and the past of your culture and carry them forward to a new place that only you can take them. The more cynical among us say things like, love is a chemical reaction of endorphins, no different from eating a lot of chocolate. And if you melted a person down, the raw materials would be worth about 80 cents. Well, fair enough, cynics. But I'm here to say that each and every one of you is made in the image of God and is unique and has a destiny that is for you alone. No one can live your life but you. No one will ever know the things you know the way you know them. No one will ever feel the things you feel exactly the way you feel them. Only you can go on the journey God is calling you to take. And that journey, even if your journey means staying in your childhood home your whole life, is filled with the potential for discovery and wonder and heroism. That being said, when you have fought so hard to reach Anchises and to save him from destruction, you may be tempted to try to live the life Anchises led. You cannot. As Aeneas is tempted to stay at Pergamum, a miniature Troy, and at Buthrotum, another imitation Troy, you will be tempted to write the way that Willa Cather or Toni Morrison or Alexander Pope or John Donne or John Keats wrote, and you cannot. You are not Anchises, you are Aeneas. You must write your poems and stories and plays and essays. I'll never forget when my own Anchises, Derek Walcott, told me over martinis, you must write your hillbilly poems. I didn't want to write hillbilly poems. I just spent years trying to get rid of my hillbilly accent. And now here was a Nobel laureate telling me that for all that effort, I had to write my hillbilly poems. Walcott helped me discover that I couldn't live in a replica Troy, that I had to seek, like Aeneas, my own Italia, my own telos. The same is true for you. Now, we focus so much on Anchises, we haven't said anything about Ascanius, Aeneas' child. Here's the thing. The way to learn the future is by learning the past. We cannot take Ascanius and leave Anchises behind. We take both or neither? This is one of the supreme lessons of Aeneas Catabasis in Book 6. We discover the way forward by looking backward. In the arts, innovation is almost 100% of the time renovation. As revolutionary as Paul Cézanne was in some ways, his first serious picture is The Bark of Dante, an imitation of a painting by Delacroix called The Bark of Dante. And the first picture Cézanne sold was The Modern Olympia, an imitation of Manet's 1863 Succès de Scandale called Olympia. Indeed, Cézanne's mature aesthetic is largely a combination of techniques and effects from Delacroix, Gustave Courbet, Manet, and Camille Pissarro. Or again, Michelangelo Buonarroti's mature aesthetic comes from harmonizing Dante's Thomistic aesthetics predicated on Christ's kenosis with the glorious musculature of classical sculpture to extend Raphael's move toward perspective and verisimilitude. Thus we have King David as a Greek Kouros and the deux esclaves, or two slaves, merge Christian metaphysics with the classical Laocoon. For all that, having reached Anchises and Ascanius and led them out of the fire, your journey has only begun. Creusa, whom you love dearly, is likely to be lost. Creusa may indeed symbolize a lover or a friend, but she may also symbolize contentment or comfort. The poet is, as Virgil's dear friend Horace noted, a genus irritabile, an irritable type. Or it may be that what is lost is money, or time, or, very likely, both. Your journey will bring losses, inevitably. Sunt lacrimae rerum. Indeed, at a certain point, which we'll call your own Sicily, you'll lose Anchises himself. The poet or writer who got you started will no longer satisfy, and you must press on alone through hardship, deprivation, and struggle. Primarily, like Aeneas, you'll struggle with yourself. In the 10th of Virgil's Eclogues, he writes very famously, Omnia vincit amor. Love conquers all. In the Georgics, he updates his claim to labor omnia vicit. Labor conquered all. The verb tense of vincere, to conquer, shifting from present to past. Significantly, labor in Latin isn't just labor in the sense of hard work, it's also struggle, endurance, suffering. Enduring the suffering that comes with struggling at your destined work, he says, conquered all. Finally, in Book 6 of the Aeneid, Virgil updates his claim again, having Anchises say to his son, Viciti ter durum pietas. Piety conquered the hard journey. Piety, and let us recall that Aeneas is Pius Aeneas, for Virgil doesn't mean what it often means in contemporary English. We most often hear the word pious or piety used ironically to mean something like sanctimony. But pietas is for Virgil a blend of amor and labor, of love and suffering. Indeed, we might render it passion, if we recall that passion, in our English sense of the word, comes from Christ's passion. To have pietas is to have a passion in the true sense, to give yourself to that which you love so greatly that you not only die for it, but you live your whole life for it. You sacrifice yourself for it. Now, lots of people like to play around with writing, and that is perfectly good and healthy. Just as lots of people, myself included, like to shoot hoops in the driveway. But there's a categorical difference between what I can do with my rickety knees in the driveway and what LeBron James and Stephen Curry do when they play basketball. Similarly, if you are called to write, if that is your God-given vocation, then you'll need to do more than play. You must fight to find your own Anchises and your Ascanius, and you must go forward with them on a journey where ultimately only God can guide you, in order to fulfill your promise and write the new civilization only you can write. Finally, you will give yourself up in a private passion, but you will not see the end of that passion. Others will carry forward your work as you carried Anchises, to places you will not see. You will not see the walls of high Rome that others can build only because you fulfilled your calling. Homer could never have imagined Virgil, or Virgil Dante, or Dante Milton, or Milton Walcott. You do not write for the transient acclaim or dubious auctoritas of having written well. You write to give back to God and to your fellow humans all those gifts which you have been so blessed as to receive, so that all of your love and all of your laborious suffering may be transfigured into a sacrifice. May it be acceptable and to bring praise and glory to God. Thanks.
All right, thank you to all our panelists. We actually have a full 14 minutes for questions, so everybody came in under time. We have a microphone going around. For those of you that weren't here at the beginning, the Q&A is being recorded, so we want you to speak your question into the microphone. Also, take a moment to think upon all three presentations as you're coming up with your questions, and make sure your questions are indeed a question. So I see a hand in the back, and then a second one in the gentleman in the lovely tweed coat.
Hi, thank you so much. I think this question is inspired by the last talk, but depending on how you take it, could be answered by anyone. So whenever I think about that image of Aeneas, I think about the fact that he lost Creusa, which bothers me. But I was thinking about it in the parable. When you think about tradition, any of the three of you, is there something that we're kind of supposed to lose? Can we push the parable that far? Is there an element of shedding that's involved in how you think about this? That's my question.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
I was told to be very intimate with the microphone. Yes. We are told to shed the old man and put on the new, and I think that's a large part of it.
I would just say that in Dana Gioia's The Underworld, fascinatingly, the protagonist, you, doesn't really have a lover who has been left behind. And that's maybe part of what makes it resonantly contemporary, given the state of love, in our time.
Yeah, I think so much of my work with Levertov, I think people see her as shedding everything, and I'm trying to work up just how much of the tradition, trying to situate her within the tradition and show how much she is retaining, even while she, leaves a lot of regular verse patterns behind. But I actually think T.S. Eliot on this is very helpful. I think about East Coker, where the third section of East Coker is darkness, and it's physical and spiritual darkness, and what does it mean to, he talks about giving up hope and thought. And so what does it mean to go through to the fourth section, which is doctrine and the words of the church, and how much has to be given up before you get to that fourth section? And even that beautiful image of the field in section 2 or section 1 of East Coker, it's a beautiful image. We love the dancing and the farming and the interactions. And what does he say? If you do not come too close, if you do not come too close, as if you can't go simply back to the past and stay there. You have to take your Aeneas with you. So I think that poem actually charts a beautiful image of what it means to be in relationship to the tradition and just how much you'll have to give up along the way.
Thank you all very much. Considering education and the child, how does one build the muscle of attention to be fully present in the world, to avoid the easy descent into hell, to stay the path? Maybe if you would briefly share images from your own life of this was a moment that really caused me to be attentive or shaped my development as a thinker and a writer.
Ludditeism.
I mean, I do think that if I'm hesitating before I wax too freely on the state of contemporary education vis-a-vis the state of, for example, Catholic culture or Catholic family life. But, you know, for example, my children attended a Chesterton Academy, my two oldest teenagers, and they have some of the best possible teachers, and they're reading the best, great and good books. But almost every single one of their classmates spends their evenings playing video games and checking their text messages without leaving their room. And so and I think you absolutely cannot have it both ways. I mean, they tried to bring in like a former FBI agent to talk to parents on the dangers of, you know, smartphones or something. It didn't really do anything, because I think we want to have it both ways. We don't want to look both ways, right, in a kind of Janus-like fashion, or looking forward to Ascanius and looking backward to Anchises. There's a kind of a desire to have it both ways, I think, and that's impossible.
I think the scariest part of our problem with technology is probably that we're all really aware of what it does and very unwilling to change practices, especially as adults who might check Twitter while telling their, children or students not to do the same. But I think so much of it is not just what we're not doing, but what we're doing instead. And when you said that, actually the thing that came to mind when I was being raised without social media, I was homeschooled, and my mom read aloud for something like 2 to 4 hours a day. And I actually, when I think about the sacrifice of time and energy in her voice that was, we were like, keep going. And she did. What kind of attention was that building? I mean, the community of my siblings, of her sacrifice to us. We would draw, we would have tea parties, and we would all listen for something like 2 to 4 hours. But when I think about what you would need to sacrifice to do that, it's not just what we're not doing, it's like the sacrifice of time to fill the spaces for this, like, we're putting off technology. What are all these kids doing instead? And I think it will demand a lot more of us.
Can I follow up on that, Christina? You had a quotation from Levertov that I will not get correct, but it was something like criminally impoverished imagination. Criminally neglected imagination. I think it's important that we recall that imagination is adjunct to memory, and that we're all tempted in every down moment to distract ourselves rather than strengthening our memory. I always encourage people to memorize poems, memorize anything that is beautiful, so that you're filling these spaces with not just an absence of what is toxic, but with lots of good, beautiful, true things, and cultivating that habit, I think, can't start too young.
All right, gentleman in the corduroy. Here, we've got a microphone.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask about kind of the relationship between innovation and renovation. I feel like what's so unique about the Catholic position is obviously this long history that we want to lean into and we want to embrace. And then I feel like the temptation on the other side is to say that anything that's current or new ends up kind of detracting from what's pure or what's what's a part of Catholicism. So to moving forward means embracing both of those things, but if you could just kind of elaborate a little bit on where you see the line or the tension, or where maybe particular times in your art, you've come across I'm a writer, and sometimes I can tell that I've crossed the line, and it's interesting. So.
I'll try to be brief. Yes, this is integral to Catholic art, but it's also the definition of what classical art is. Virgil is the classical artist, and he's not doing anything that's totally new either. He's indebted to the Alexandrian poets of the 3rd century before him, and on and on and on, right? The great Greek tragedians are all indebted to Homer. Homer himself, if we follow Milman Parry, comes from folk tales. Everyone is carrying things forward. The trick is that we live in a culture informed by Henry Fordism that wants to throw out the past, and that's ubiquitous. And so we have to fight to get anchises, but as I said, we can't live in the past. We have to go to a new place, and that's daunting because there's a comfort in simply imitating what's been done before. But we're not living before. We have to meet our moment and bring to bear the virtues and the techniques and skills of the tradition, to bring those to bear on our moment, to help bring order and understanding and self-knowledge to our time. Dante was not writing for the Romans of the Aetas Aurea. Virgil was not writing for the Greeks of the 8th century BC. They're writing for their own time. And we have to have the courage to meet our moment. And we have to have accumulated the skills and the knowledge and the wisdom to be able to meet our moment honestly. Where do we cross the line? You're not really going to know, and it's not really even for you to judge. Because art is ultimately not for you if you're an artist. It's for everyone else. And you sacrifice yourself and hope that it is helpful to others. That's my...
A true sign that I'm definitively getting old, even though I was born with the soul of an 86-year-old man. It's finally happening, is that I'm basically just saying the same thing over and over every year at this conference, which is basically that, we have a serious problem with the Tolkien-Chesterton industrial complex among conservative, quote-unquote conservative Catholics, and there's just this inability to escape that culture, in that particular culture industry, and that is not a slight against Tolkien, and it is not a slight against Chesterton. It is a slight against kind of nostalgia incorporated. And I would also just then expand the answer to thinking through, what it looks like to both look backwards and then look forwards and not sort of lose sight of what's behind you while trying to make what's new. I mean, in the MFA at the University of St. Thomas, it's a very peculiar MFA program in that most MFA programs are caught in a kind of presentism, which is basically, just like sexism or racism. It's this kind of pathological fixation on one feature and making it a kind of totality. So in most MFAs, anything that's 20 or 30 years old is too old. It's bunk. And our students are reading Virgil, they're reading Dostoevsky, and actually one of the questions that students ask in the class Dostoevsky and the Eternal Questions is, can we really learn anything from Dostoevsky and apply it to our work now? We're not living in 19th century Russia, and I think that what a good writer needs to figure out how to do is to inhabit the great texts so fully, and then to inhabit your neighborhood, your city, so completely that you do not neglect either of them until you feel the stretch, right? And it's only when you start to feel the stretch that you can begin to conceive of the analogous application of the older text to the new situation and the new idiom. So one example that I gave yesterday at a talk was that in Flannery O'Connor's final unfinished novel, Why Do the Heathen Rage, she was reading Dostoevsky heavily while she was working on that novel. And there's a scene in Dostoevsky's Idiot where one of the main characters looks up at an image of the dead Christ in the tomb. And it's an ugly Jesus that is terrifying to him. And he says, you could lose your faith looking at that image. In O'Connor's Why Did the Heathen Rage, she has there's been an aggiornamento of that image in the sense that it's a different ugly Jesus, but it's the similar kind of device that now, instead of hanging on the wall in a drawing room of a kind of classic 19th century building that we can all imagine from the 19th century novel, it's a tattoo on the farmhand's back, if that makes sense, right? So, and we know how ubiquitous tattoos are. I mean, I have Radiohead tattoos that I will not show you, and other things. And so it's just sort of like it makes sense that it would end up on someone's body rather than on a wall, because that's just what people do now. Does that kind of make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, just to echo what's already been said, I think that T.S. Eliot is a good guide for this in the 20th century. I think he's somehow snuck into what we've all considered as canon, and yet if you read him really carefully, you're like, oh yeah, he's steeped in tradition, loves these authors, incorporating them, and yet breaking form all over the place to create something new. And through that model, we then can collect other poets who we would align with that mode of this living tradition. But I always think, after Eliot wrote the quartets and the Wasteland and all his most famous poetry, what he really wanted to do was write a Broadway hit, so that poetry would go into the lives of regular people. And he says not to take them out of their lives, but to illuminate the surfaces of their lives. And he, after writing some bad verse dramas, writes The Cocktail Party, which I think is a good verse drama. And it has a big run on Broadway and the West End, and to him that's a triumph because it's poetry for the people that throw cocktail parties. So I think that actually seeing the whole of Eliot's canon actually opens up new artists in the 20th century who are steeped in the tradition, like Levertov, and are using new forms for it. And I think it's just a really good model for us.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.